Okay. So data standards training for today, it shouldn't take us a full hour. We'll see how long it actually takes us. So changes took effect on Sunday, this past Sunday, October 1st, and that's pretty standard. Each year, HUD releases new data standards, and they almost always take effect on October 1st. So anybody that's entered after October 1st should reflect these changes that we're going over. There's no need to go back to anybody that was entered before October 1st and make any changes. You just start fresh with the new data standards as of October 1st. There are some changes, very basic ones, that'll impact all programs. We'll go over those first. And then there are a couple of changes that are going to impact the permanent housing programs. And I know that some of Bell's Next Door program is on this call, so as a heads up to you, you'll want to pay attention to those changes because those will play a part when it comes to rental assistance programs that will be opening with you guys, hopefully, in the very near future. Okay, so the first change that affects everyone is gender. Currently, the gender options are as listed on the left-hand side. In 2016, they had added transgender male to female and transgender female to male and doesn't identify as male, female, or transgender. So for 2017, they've made some updates to the language for those options. Those options are now trans female, MTF, or male to female, trans male, FTM, or female to male, and gender non-conforming, i.e. not exclusively male or female. Those were just updated to abide by other federal programs that are using that language. And that's how it'll look on your screen now. When you choose gender, those are going to be your new options. When you go into your entry exit screens to work on clients, you'll want to make sure that you are working on the 2017 assessments. So these are what the 2017 assessment names look like. They all have York after them. They all have 2017 after them. And the ones that you'll use depends on your project. So the first one listed there is SOESSH. That stands for Street Outreach, Emergency Shelter, and Safe Haven. And then, of course, any other program uses the All Other Projects version for entry. The update is used when you do annual assessments, and it is also used, it'll be used to capture housing move-in date, which is probably the biggest change for the permanent housing and longer-term housing options, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then, of course, the exit assessment is used at exit. Destination, when you're exiting a client, also has some changes. In 2016, we had an option that was just permanent housing for formerly homeless persons. HUD has decided to expand that so that we can do a better job of capturing information about people that are moving into either permanent housing that is not rapid rehousing or permanent housing that is rapid rehousing type subsidy. So now in 2017, you'll see that those destination choices have been revised to capture permanent housing other than RRH, which is rapid rehousing, for formerly homeless persons. And then there's a new option, which is rental by client with RRH or equivalent subsidy. So the biggest thing that means is if your client is in an emergency or transitional housing program, or they're in case management and they move into housing, you're going to reflect that either by choosing permanent housing, which would be someplace like the YMCA, it would be someplace like our Bell York Apartments or Turning Point Interfaith Missions program, anything of that nature. Or if they're getting rental assistance through one of the various funding streams for rental assistance, that would be the rapid rehousing or equivalent subsidy. So that's the one you would want for any kind of rental. And that's just what those two new options look like. When you are filling out the entry assessments, there are a couple of changes to non-cash benefits. When you go into the HUD verification link for non-cash benefits, you will find that Section 8 public housing or rental assistance has been removed as an option, as well as temporary rental assistance. Those options were pretty old. They had been in long before rapid rehousing programs were even a thing, and they just no longer were appropriate for collection under non-cash benefits. So your non-cash benefits list now is much shorter, and that's what it looks like moving forward. There are some changes on the disabilities HUD verification as well, and I think everyone is going to be really excited about this one because the pop-up when you chose a disability was pretty lengthy, and the questions you had to answer were sort of, you jumped around on the screen, and it was a really just ugly and confusing screen for a lot of people. So when you are entering a person and you complete their HUD verification link for disabilities, if you choose a disability, they have removed a lot of the questions. They've removed whether or not there is documentation of the disability on file. They've removed both of the path-only questions, and they've removed the question about whether or not the person is currently receiving services or treatment. So what that means is your disability screen is much shorter, and it looks something like this now. So the only things you'll still be answering is it'll want to know if they have the disability. That's the disability determination. And they want to know if the disability is expected to be of long continued and indefinite duration and substantially impair ability to live independently. They want to know a start date, which traditionally fills in as the entry date into the program, and that's fine. And they'll want to know if the condition is going to be long term, and that's it. So no more jumping around on that screen. There were no changes to the categories for disabilities. There were just changes to this additional information that was provided. Now, the permanent housing changes. And when I say permanent housing, I mean permanent supportive housing. I mean places like the YMCA that are more single room occupancy. I mean all of the rental assistance programs, regardless of their funding stream. There are some big changes here. I don't think they're necessarily too complicated. I think you guys are completely capable of them, but they are very different, I think, than how we've done things in the past. So right now when you're entering a client in HMIS, you have an entry date, and historically the entry date has been kind of the day you've accepted them into your program. Like you've run through sort of intake with them, you've been collecting paperwork on whether they're eligible based on your different program criteria, eligibility standards, their homeless status, things like that. And on the entry assessment, there has been a question about residential move-in date. It's been near the very bottom, and most programs have not been filling it in. We've not really been mandating it up until this point. For 2017, we now have an entry date and we have a housing move-in date, and both of those are required to be answered in permanent housing situations. So what that means, the entry date as of October 1st is identified by HUD as the date the person was admitted to the program. The definition of being admitted to a program is that information from the consumer or the referral source indicates the person meets the criteria for admission. It means that the consumer has indicated that they want to be housed by your program, and it means that the client is able to access services and housing through your program in a reasonably short amount of time. So what this all means is you are admitting someone to a program based on self-information or referral information. So admittance date, your entry date, needs to start being the day you have started working with the person. It's not the day, and we'll go over this twice, I think. It's not the day that you have all the paperwork in place. It's the day that you've received the referral or you've spoken to the consumer and it sounds like they meet the eligibility criteria. So it is long before all that documentation is collected. The consumer indicating they want to be housed by the program is pretty self-explanatory. The consumer has shown interest in being housed by your program. They've not said, no, I can't do that, or your program won't work because you have stairs and I can't do stairs, or something of that nature. And the client is able to access services and housing through the program in a reasonably short amount of time is really just a HUD safeguard against waitlisting. So that one just means you wouldn't admit someone to the program unless you had an active unit or an active slot open in your program and you were moving towards filling that unit. The housing move-in date, which is located on the assessment screens, is the date the person actually moved into housing. So what this big change really does is this is HUD's new way of determining from the time a person first expresses interest in your housing program until they are housed. How long does that take? So that's what we're measuring moving forward. So as I said before, admittance is not the day that you have finally collected all the necessary documentation on homeless verification and income verification and all of those documents that you need to house someone. It's the day that you've officially decided to move forward with that process for the consumer. Information from the consumer or the referral source to your program, which for a lot of you is going to be coordinated entry, is enough to qualify a person. So as an example, if a program only takes chronically homeless people, as a reminder, those people would have a disability and would have a long history of homelessness. If that program gets a referral and the consumer has said, look, I have a physical disability, I've had it for a long time, and I've been on the street for a long time, at least a year, if not more, that is enough for an admittance date. So that's the date you said, okay, it sounds like this person is eligible for my program. That would be your new entry date. So just as a reminder, the language on HMIS hasn't changed. So it still says entry date when you go in to add an entry exit. Emergency shelter and transitional housing programs do not have to change how they do this. And for next door case management, you guys will continue to do your case management date the same way you have been. But for permanent housing, permanent supportive housing, and rapid rehousing, you are going to reflect an admittance date here. At the bottom of the assessment, you'll see that housing move-in date. It used to be called residential move-in date, and it was in the exact same place. So they've changed the language a little bit, but again, emergency shelter, transitional housing, you do not have to fill this part in. Permanent housing, permanent supportive housing, and rapid rehousing, this is the date the person actually moves into a unit through your program. Now, HUD had discussed a field to add on after housing move-in date to capture information about why a moving date might be blank. Because we're going to be collecting information at admittance rather than after all the documentation is done and you are ready to move them into a unit, there are going to be situations where a person starts the admittance process with your program but doesn't move into housing. So HUD threw around the idea of collecting that information, but they couldn't release that question in time for the data standards, so they have not done it. But we were encouraged as local communities that we should add an option to track that information so that we know why a person isn't being housed in a program. So we'll talk a little bit about that piece in a minute. So how you enter the housing move-in date correctly. So the move-in date shows up on entry assessments and also on update assessments. But since your entry date and your housing move-in date are most likely not going to be the same date, you're going to need to do your housing move-in date as an update. So I guess it's possible that your admittance or entry date and housing move-in date could be the same, but what that would mean for permanent housing providers would be the consumer was referred, they completed their intake, all the paperwork was provided, and they moved into housing on the same day. So I don't really think we're going to see a lot of that. But for most part, you're going to have an entry date that comes before, let's say, September 1st of 2017 is their admittance date. And then their housing move-in date might be the 20th of September. Your entry date is going to reflect September 1st, your admittance date. And then you're going to have to go into the system and complete an update for the 20th of September so you can enter the housing move-in date. So I give you some instruction here on how it works. You'll choose the interims button on the entry exit screen. You'll choose update as your review type. You'll type in the date the person moved into housing as your update date. You'll save and continue that screen, and it will take you to the update assessment. At the bottom of the update assessment, you'll see the housing move-in date. You can put that in and save and exit. Here are some screens to help that sound a little bit more a little less complicated. So when you're on the entry exit screen, of course, you have your program listed there and the entry date. This example lists an entry date of 10/3/2016. After that, you'll see an interims button, and it can be hard to see on your screen, but what it actually is, what the icon actually is a piece of paper with check boxes on it. You'll click on that button, and it'll bring up a little pop-up that says interim reviews. You'll click on the add interim review button. You'll get another pop-up, and it'll ask you interim review type. There is a drop-down list here. It has 30-day, 60-day, 90-day, 120-day, annual assessment, and update. For housing move-in date, you will want update. You'll enter the date that the person was housed, and it will take you into the assessment screen. You will automatically go to the update screen, at which point you will just have to scroll down to the bottom where you will see housing move-in date, and you can type in the date that person was housed and save and exit. I think I have a question here. Let's see. I do have a question. So Kathy wanted to know if entry date would be when they get put on the waiting list for shelter. No, Kathy, for emergency shelter and for transitional housing, entry date is the first night they stay with you. So it's the same as it has been for emergency shelter and transitional housing. These questions about admittance date and housing move-in date are for permanent housing options. So for emergency shelter, transitional housing programs, your entry date is the first night they stay in your shelter or in your transitional housing. So, of course, this begs the question, what if the consumer never reaches housing? So you enter them in your program using an admittance date, and you start going through the paperwork process, and you find, for whatever reason, it doesn't work. They end up not actually being eligible, they disappear on you and don't return to complete the process, or any host of other reasons that they don't go into housing through your program. You'll want to document the admittance date as your entry date, and you'll complete the entry information assessment as you know it at that point. If something prevents them from entering housing in your program, before you exit them, I ask you to go into those interim assessments, create an update, and leave the move-in date blank, because you don't have a move-in date because they never moved in. Under that is a question that I've added locally that says reason housing move-in date is blank. It's a drop-down, and it has a couple of options in it right now, but I'm going to actually ask for help at the end of this call and see if anyone has anything else for me to add to it. So you'll add an update, you'll say why they weren't housed, and then you'll go in and just do an exit like you normally would from a program. So you'll see here that I have included reason housing move-in date is blank. And I have just a couple of options there, so I had an example for your training. I put did not locate housing by deadline, ineligible for program, no showed on program, data not collected. I'm sure there are others, so I would like to know other reasons people don't make it into your program. You can tell me on the phone, or you can email me later. I'll take either one. One that I thought of this morning is probably one about entering an institution before they were able to locate housing. So I will add something to that effect. But I want to make sure this is comprehensive for those of you that are dealing with housing and why someone might not be housed. So that's it. Questions? Anybody? You guys are so quiet.
I think it's pretty self-explanatory, Kelly. Thank you.
Okay, good. I was worried the admittance date thing would throw everyone for a loop.
Well, I'm glad you explained it. If I would have just seen it, I might have gone, but with what you told us, it's good. I got it.
Okay, very good. All right, you're, of course, always welcome to email me later if you have questions or call me. Once I end the training, I publish the recording. I've been doing it both in GoToWebinar and also in YouTube, and then an email is sent out from GoToWebinar with both of those links. So if you have any questions moving forward, you can review the training that we did today.
All right, thank you, Kelly.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.